Welcome everyone to our final section, part 3 of Sunriver U and the Owner Enrichment Committee's presentation of the history of Sunriver, presented by John Salzer. My name is Nathan Moses, the Assistant Director of University Events and Community Engagement for your Bend Beeves at OSU Cascades. We've had so much fun bringing you this information over the last few weeks, and tonight, John brings you the more recent history along Sunriver's timeline. But before we get to that, let's run through a few upcoming events from Sunriver U. All right, first up, we have a TED Talks event. There's going to be presenting 2 TED Talks, Why I Have Coffee with People Who Send Me Hate Mail as presentation 1, and How I Climbed a 3,000-foot vertical cliff without ropes will be choice number 2. These are going to be shown, followed by discussions led by no one other than himself, John Salzer, for a presentation on Monday, April 19th. At 2:30 p.m. This will be a Zoom presentation. There will also be a Medicare 101, what you need to know about Medicare, happening on Tuesday, May 11th at 4 p.m. Also Zoom presentation. Are you turning 65 in the next year or two? Wondering how to find out what you need to know about parts A, B, C, and D, and about supplemental advantage plans? Sherry Martin will present an overview of the requirements and resources to know about in order to make the best decision for you. Topics will include enrollment timing, Medicare vocabulary, the birthday rule, and both in-person and website resources. Thirdly, Music Matters. This is a 6-week series designed to bring music to life. You will learn the secrets of musicianship. I was going to mess that up as soon as I saw it. And the art of listening, and how an abundance of elements come together to create music. You'll develop skills to interact with music beyond simply listening. You'll grow beyond passive listening and into an active experience. Again, this is a 6-part series starting on Monday, May 24th at 5 p.m. to 6 p.m. Also Zoom presentation. And finally, there's going to be an emergency preparedness event on Wednesday, May 26th. How prepared are you for a natural or man-made disaster in Deschutes County? Do you know the hazards of our region faces and what to do if one occurs? Are you interested in connecting with local leaders for accurate and timely emergency communications? We have all heard many times, it's not when, or that's not if, but when. The need to be prepared is real, but can be daunting. Ashley Volz will cover all of these topics and share actionable tasks to make the job of preparedness less overwhelming. Again, this will be Wednesday, May 26th at 4 p.m. via Zoom. And again, like we've talked about before, you're going to find all of these classes at Sunriver U's website, sunriveryou.com, and there's much more listed beyond these. You can get more information about the classes and how you're going to register. Registration is required for each of these upcoming classes, but again, they're offered at no cost, so you should check them out. All right, and then those of you joining us tonight, hopefully this is the 3rd time you've seen us to stay in track with what John's been presenting, but we will be utilizing Mentimeter for our audience participation this evening for question answers. We are ready to go with this. You can start asking questions literally as soon as John starts presenting. What you do is you go to www.menti.com, or you can hold your smartphones up and take a picture of that QR code to take you right to the menti.com app. We're going to use event code 58408157, which is listed at the bottom of your screen tonight. So you can give direct questions to us. Again, I remind you, if you'd like to include an email address in case we don't get to your question tonight, John would love to be able to answer that. So please keep that in mind. Those of you joining us with YouTube accounts, you can also put everything in chat this evening if you'd like to do that as well. So again, that's our audience participation. We'll do a reminder as we get to the question answer session a little bit closer to 7 o'clock tonight. All right, so without further ado, I'm going to give a little bit of introduction about John. Again, most of you have heard this, but those of you that are joining us for the first time tonight, John is a 1966 graduate of Oregon State University and later attended Stanford, where he received his MBA before working in the telecommunications industry for 35 years. In 2001, John helped establish the OSU Cascades Foundation and served as its chairperson for 6 years. He's also been active in various nonprofits, including serving as Sunriver's United Way campaign chair for 19 years, helping to spearhead Sunriver's Shark Project, and establishing the Sunriver Service District to provide oversight to the police and fire departments. John is full of all kinds of fantastic history, useful information, and like we've talked about before, is generally a pretty awesome guy. So I'd like to welcome back to part 3, John Salzer.
Thank you, Nathan. I appreciate the introduction. For those of you out there who haven't participated in the first one, first two sessions. This is going to be a fun one for me because we moved here, my wife and I moved here in 1999. So much of what I'm going to share with you tonight, I lived through. So the first two sessions were where I'd gone and gotten a lot of research. This one was firsthand knowledge. So it's been kind of fun. So this project has really been a wonderful journey for me. It's been a lot of work and a lot of time, but it's been really fun to do. So thank you for joining me for this third in the series of presentations dealing with the history of Sunriver. Hopefully those of you who have participated in the first two, or one of the first two, came away learning something you didn't know about our wonderful community beforehand. So it's been beneficial. Next slide. The nice thing about partnering with OSU Cascades and Nathan in making these presentations is that we can utilize the latest technology, allowing us to record these presentations so that others will be able to view the classes at their leisure on YouTube in the future. Next slide. So our first class started with the eruption of Lava Butte some 7,000 years ago and ended with the opening of the development in 1969. The second class focused on what happened between 1970 and the mid-90s. This class will focus on the history from the mid-90s to today. Sunriver U has agreed to have me put on 2 additional classes as a result of what we've done so far. One will focus on the history of the Village Mall, and the other on the history of Shark, both of which are fascinating stories in their own right. So stay tuned for information as to when these classes will be held. Next slide. I've divided tonight's segment into 3 segments. The first segment deals with the significant role that the resort has played in bringing Sunriver's vision to life. Then the second segment, I will share with you the dark side of our history that occurred during the mid-2000s when our community was on life support and most of us didn't even know it. Our future looked very bleak. Finally, in the third segment, I'll focus on what was done to bring the community back to life and thriving. Time permitting, I also have another special historical event worth mentioning, but that will be, I couldn't figure out how to weave it into this program. So we, hopefully with time permitting, I'll share that with you. So let's start by highlighting the key role that the resort has played and is continuing to play in fulfilling Sunriver's vision. Next slide. Let me digress just for a moment. Prior to 1983, access to Mount Bachelor was limited. You had to drive from Sunriver to Bend in order to get up to the mountain. And it was a 38-mile round trip. So it wasn't convenient. So in 1983, to make the Sunriver more attractive to everyone, the resort obtained a special use permit from the U.S. Forest Service and converted an unimproved logging road into a year-round access road to Mount Bachelor. Next slide. This cut the drive down to 11 miles. Not only did the resort pay to have the road built, they also maintained it for many years. While significant, this was just one of the many things that the resort has done for the benefit of everyone in our community. Next slide. In our last class, we learned that Sunriver Resort Limited Partnership purchased Sunriver Resort from Connecticut Mutual in 1993. So this is where I'm kind of starting. So for the past 28 years, the community has been blessed to have these 3 talented individuals who have totally embraced John Gray's vision for our community, but also have stayed in their positions of leadership long enough to make a significant change in how we operate and for the benefit of the entire community. The end result today is that Sunriver can compete with any recreational destination spot in the country. So let me just share with you some of the highlights that each of these individuals accomplished, starting with Charlie Peck. Next slide. As soon as Charlie Peck took over as managing director in 1993, he had the company renovate the lodge. Next slide. They also acquired the privately owned tennis facility that was adjacent to the resort and transformed it into what is now known as Sage Springs Club and Spa. And those of you who have visited that facility know how nice it is. Next slide. In addition, they built these River Lodge condos, adding 33 rooms to their facilities in the resort. Next slide. Under Peck's leadership, Sunriver Resort Limited Partnership also approved a property exchange in 1993 with SROA, with our SROA, so the Owners Association. And this enabled each organization to consolidate and enhance their respective properties. I can't emphasize enough how important that agreement was. The resort turned over ownership of the North Pole pool and the tennis courts, land in the Fort Rock Park area and the corporation yard, plus cash to be used to replace tennis courts that were owned by SROA but turned over to the resort. So that's how we ended up getting the North Pool and the tennis courts up there in the north part of town of the community. In exchange, the resort received land in and around the resort core area, which has allowed them to ultimately build the Cove and the soon to be open Cove Indoor Aquatics facility. So they were able to consolidate what they needed around the resort, and we got what we wanted. So it really was a win-win, and we both benefit over time. Next slide. Under Charlie's leadership, the partnership also did a major renovation of the Great Hall in 1995, and this is what the end result was after they completed the renovation. Next slide. Then in 1995, they purchased 600 acres from Connecticut Mutual, and it became Crosswater. So we all know how impressive Crosswater is. So this was a very impressive list of accomplishments that Charlie Peck did that benefit all of us. Next slide. So he turned over the reins to Tom Lurison, and Tom was a wonderful person to work with. I had an opportunity to do that. Tom didn't waste any time. He quickly initiated a $5.5 million upgrade, an additional upgrade to the lodge. Next slide. Then 2 years later, he added the 18-hole putting course to the lodge and did a major renovation to the Meadows Golf Course. Then the following year, the resort built the Homestead building shown here. Next slide. Then in 2002, under Tom's leadership, the partnership purchased 400 acres across from Crosswater and began developing Caldera Springs, which first opened in 2006. Next slide. Probably the two greatest achievements that that occurred while Tom was managing director, most of us don't even know about. But while one was the widening of Highway 97 from Bend to Sunriver, and the second started the effort to create a circle at the entrance to Sunriver on South Century. Next slide. Old timers like myself and a lot of the audience readily recall that one of the real safety concerns 20 years ago was getting to and from Bend on Highway 97. The highway was 2 lanes going over Lava Butte with no guardrail, and it went all the way past Sunriver. Traffic on the highway had doubled in the past 10 years to over 20,000 cars per day. Late Sunday morning, visitors who were leaving Sunriver after vacationing for the weekend would back up a half mile or more, trying to turn north onto Highway 97 off of South Century Drive. This is a picture of what the turnoff from South Century to Highway 97 looked like back then. This was a real issue for residents and guests alike, And Tom decided he had to do something about it. Next slide. As part of the ultimate decision, I'm missing a slide here, just a second here. So I'm on slide 21. So Tom scheduled a meeting with the Oregon Department of Transportation to discuss this issue. Representatives from the resort, Sunriver Owners Association, Deschutes County, and some of the Sunriver property management companies also attended. As a result of the meeting, unfortunately, ODOT had very little interest in fixing this problem and said that they had higher priorities. But they made a comment that they said that ODOT might be interested if the community would help finance it. So that's what they ultimately agreed, that they might move the project up on their priority list if the community would help finance the project. Tom Lurison got the parties together and we agreed, including SROA, agreed to help finance this project. And that is actually how Highway 97 was expanded to 4 lanes when it did. So go back to slide 20. As part of the ultimate decision, Highway 97 was not only divided, but also this interchange at Cottonwood was included in the project. The end result was that getting to and off, on and off of Highway 97 became a non-issue. So go to the highway to number 22, slide 22. Similarly, the main entrance to Sunriver from South Century Drive was a real bottleneck, especially in the winter, as skiers came down South Century Drive, Spring River Road at that area, came home to Sunriver from Mount Bachelor. Drivers came by the business park and had to negotiate a stop sign to turn left into Sunriver. It would often back up for a half mile or more before you could get to turn into Sunriver. Next slide. So Tom used the same collaborative approach, and the group was able to convince Deschutes County to build this roundabout with various local organizations helping to fund it. Next slide. Of course, the resort also stood to benefit from these 2 improvements, the highway, dividing the highway, and the entrance to Sunriver, but we as an entire community also benefited as well. Next slide. Shortly thereafter, Tom O'Shea became the managing director in 2009 and has been there ever since. Next slide. Tom immediately put in a plan to renovate and upgrade both the Sunriver Marina, shown here after the upgrade, and the Sunriver Stables, shown here. Next slide. Then in 2015, the resort spent $50 million to build what is called the Cove. It's shown here. This is an outdoor aquatics complex for the exclusive use of resort guests. Next slide. The resort also completely remodeled the lodge and created Carson's, which is the new dining facility in the lodge. Next slide. If that wasn't enough, last February, Tom announced that the resort would spend an additional $40 million over the next 5 years. Already underway is the construction of a new 10,000 square foot aquatic center at the Cove, the property's pool complex. This facility is scheduled to open later this month, next month. They're also working on a full renovation of the resort's 190 guest rooms and suites. The resort has torn up the area behind the lodge and it is creating an 18-hole putting course. If that weren't enough, they also plan to enhance the horse stables and trail network and improve the regional airport. a very impressive list of projects that Tom has on the agenda. So as you can see, during the 28 years that these three individuals have been the limited partner managing directors, they have done everything they can to make Sunriver a great place to visit and to live. They have really focused on giving their guests a great experience. And this has benefited all of us in ways we might not even consider. Let me explain in more detail. As I mentioned, they plan to open their new aquatics facility before the summer this year. Everyone in the community benefits because their guests will be using the cove. This will cut down on the people using the overcrowded Shark. As I will explain later, Sunriver owners will soon have a completely rebuilt, owners-only North Pool. This allows the community the ability to spread out the crowds in the summer throughout the community. The best of all worlds. So while the resort has made all these improvements and the upgrades over the years, this led me, when I was putting the presentation together, led me to ask the following obvious question. What have we as homeowners up until for 30 years done to help? The question is, during the first 30 years of Sunriver's existence, what enhancements, improvements, or amenities can you identify that had been made by Sunriver owners? I believe one will become hard pressed to come up with a single answer, single thing. Next slide. So one might suggest that helping fund the improvements to Highway 97 and creating the roundabout entrance at Sunriver were things that we did. But these two projects, we didn't initiate them. The resort did, and all we did is support them financially. Those who owned homes during the first 30 years of our existence were able to reap the benefits of everything the resort had done without spending a dime of their own money. So in the second segment, starting now, I'm going to describe just how bleak things were in the mid-2000s regarding our homeowners' willingness and commitment to invest in our community. At the beginning, it isn't a pretty picture, but stay tuned and stay with me because the ending is a very positive one. Next slide. So how bad were things in the early part of this century? Well, our 37 miles of paved bike paths were built back in the late 60s, and they were too narrow. Next slide. And full of cracks and holes. Another problem was that tree roots had grown under the bike paths and caused them to become very bumpy. Next slide. Even our 65 miles of paved roads were full of potholes and were cracking badly. Next slide. Our 11 tunnels, which were constructed back in the late 60s, were accidents waiting to happen. You had to dismount from your bicycle and, next slide, walk single file through the tunnels, and they would only allow one-way traffic. And that's the way it is. It had been then, and it's pretty much is now. Next slide. Our 27 tennis courts weren't any better. They were falling apart, as you can see here. Next picture. Most courts had uneven playing surfaces due to settling over time. Next slide. Cracks in the surface like these shown here were all too common. Next slide. If that weren't enough, the South Pool was built in 1968 and was designed to last 30 years. Now, if you do the math, that was 1998. By the year 2008, it was 10 years beyond its life expectancy and was leaking so badly that the company that we had hired to repair it said they couldn't fix it again. It was continuing to leak. The experts said it needed to be replaced. After all, it had lasted 10 years longer than it was supposed to last. Next slide. As if this weren't enough, the Village Mall was privately owned. Homeowners didn't own it. The resort didn't own it. It was privately owned. And the owners had no interest in putting any money into repairs. Next slide. They wouldn't even spend a little money on paint. Next slide. So, just by way of information, starting in the year 2000, when we moved here, SROA began conducting an owner survey every 5 years. The results were used to see what the status was of the community and what needed to be done to help the board establish their priorities moving forward. Next slide. So the Pacific Crest, one of the few bright spots during this bleak time period was that Pacific Crest came to Sunriver. Each year during the last weekend in June, thousands of athletes and their families and friends converged in Sunriver to take part in the Pacific Crest Endurance Sports Festival. But guess who brought the event to Sunriver? No, it wasn't SROA, it wasn't a resort. It was Larry Browning, who headed up Resort Realty, one of the property management companies here in Sunriver. He also brought in several regional tennis tournaments to Sunriver each summer. He took the lead in attracting these activities after determining there was absolutely no interest expressed from the Sunriver Owners Association to be involved. Next slide. So, not only were our assets and amenities aging and falling apart, the SROA saw what other destinations were doing at this time. Versada Ranch was being developed with brand new and modern amenities. Tethrow in Bend was on the drawing board. Black Butte Ranch owners had just approved spending $15 million to build the new Blaze Meadows Aquatic Center. Remington Ranch, a destination resort, had just been announced for Prineville. And we had the new Caldera Springs starting up in our own backyard. Next slide. Interestingly, not everyone in the Sunriver community was living on our reputation and ignoring what was going on in Central Oregon destination resort communities. To their great credit, a group of 4 property managers were very concerned about what was happening elsewhere and what was not happening in Sunriver. While these 4 companies were fierce competitors for Sunriver rental properties, they realized that if something wasn't done to upgrade and add to our community's amenities, all of their rental businesses would suffer and potentially their companies would dry up. So they joined forces and purchased and expanded part of the old Sunriver Prep school facilities in the north part of town and opened up Mavericks in 2007. Next slide. The facility included features and amenities that weren't available anywhere else, such as a state-of-the-art wave runner. Next slide. They added onto their building to include this indoor swimming pool. Next slide. They included a weight room. Next slide. And even a climbing wall. The Mavericks facilities were designed and available primarily to their renters who rented from one of their 4 companies. So if you wanted to use those as a guest, you needed to rent from one of their companies. Very smart business decision. But we owners could also pay to use this facility. In my program on Shark, I will explain what happened to Mavericks. Next slide. Finally, in or about 2006, the SROA board at that time finally realized that unless some drastic actions were taken quickly, Sunriver would continue to deteriorate and might get to the point that it couldn't even recover. To their credit, the board members recognized that drastic times required drastic action. Today, you and I, if you're owners, are the real beneficiaries of the actions taken by these boards back then. Let me explain what that board did back in the 2006, 2007, and 2008 timeframe. First, they recognized the seriousness of the situation. So they knew we were in a crisis. Next slide. Second, they hired a gentleman in a company called J.T. Atkins and Company, who are a well-known Bend company, to come in and assess the situation Sunriver was in, and then prepare a document recommending the action steps that they felt were required to fix our depressed situation. Next slide. The end product of this work was a document entitled the Amenities Master Plan, which gave the board a comprehensive list of needed improvements. This became a roadmap for the board moving forward. Next slide. The Amenities Master Plan was subsequently incorporated into the SROA Infrastructure and Amenities Plan in 2012 under the guidance of the consulting firm of McKay and Saporito. This plan is now currently the guiding the board today. And if you are interested in what is included in it, you can see it in its entirety on the SROA website. Next slide. Throughout our history, the SROA staff had always felt that it was financially prudent to conduct our own reserve study. After all, didn't we have an accurate record of all of our assets? Why hire somebody from the outside to do the work we could do ourselves? Well, in 2007, the SROA general manager reluctantly agreed to hire an outside expert to come in and verify the work that we had been doing internally for years. So the third major decision that the board made was to hire a company out of Denver called the Felix Reserve Group. Next slide. So what is the reserve study? Well, first of all, you identify all of the association's assets. You realize that they aren't going to last forever. So you try to determine how long each of these assets will last. Then you figure out how much it's going to cost to replace that asset. Finally, you determine how much money do you need to set aside each month to ensure you have enough money available when you need it to replace that asset. Sounds pretty simple, right? Well, here is a copy of the study that the Felix Group did in 2009, 86 pages long, and the results were shocking. Next slide. This is a chart they used in the presentation to the board. The Felix Group used this chart to depict the various ranges of reserve funding. Of course, the higher the percentage of reserves, the better off the organization is because it reduces the need to have special assessments because the required funds are there in reserve in case you need them. If you are less than 30%, you often find yourself having to have a special assessment when a major asset needs replacing, or you end up delaying replacing that asset, or you reduce the amount of maintenance. With these are the things we delayed replacing the assets and hadn't done the maintenance for years on a lot of our assets. Based on our previous internally conducted reserve studies, we believed for years that we had always been in a strong position, meaning that we had at least 70% of the funds necessary in a reserve fund. Next slide. You can imagine the board's shock when they received the results of the Felix study which determined that our actual percent funded was just 17.5%, which, as you can see, put us in the poor category. How could that be? Because we thought we had done it right before. I'll show you. These are the chart shows that they identified 400 replaceable capital assets, but they included things like our 65 miles of roads, 37 miles of bike paths that previous studies hadn't included. We had not thought about the fact, we thought we could just maintain the roads and the bike paths, and the swimming pools and so forth. We wouldn't ever have to replace them. Well, that wasn't the case. We didn't realize we had to replace these things. In hindsight, we had really been stupid and short-sighted by not paying an outside firm to conduct our reserve study. But the fact remained that that was the situation back in 2008 when they did the study. Even the Cardinal Bridge, we didn't have in this, and never ever included the fact that we might have to replace it or do major repairs to it. As you can see from the pictures, the top of the bridge had a hole in it when they did the study, and also needed significant structural work to make it safe. It had never been included in the study. As a result of the Felix study, we ended up closing the bridge for a while until we could do some repairs. Next slide. At the time, we had over $1 million in our reserve fund. In addition, we were setting aside $47,000 each month into our reserve account. We felt that it was adequate. You can imagine the shock experienced by the board when the Felix group said that to get us into a strong position, we needed to add an additional $4.9 million. And if you could just do that, then you'd have a strong position. Well, this was a homeowners association whose boards had always prided itself on being well managed and very conservative and frugal. The Felix group said that instead of setting aside $47,000, we needed to set up that to $176,000, or approximately $130,000 more each month. If we did this successfully in the year 20,042, we'd move into the strong position. You can imagine how frightening this information was to the board at this time. So here was our situation in 2009 when they got this report. You might recall that the housing market was in a steep decline and we were facing a recession with no end in sight. The prices of housing had dropped significantly in the last couple of years. The mall was an eyesore and a total disaster. Our own infrastructure was deteriorating at an ever rapid rate. We were trying to figure out how to deal with the failing South Pool that couldn't be repaired. And then on top of this, the Felix study showed that our reserve fund needed a $4.9 million infusion. Finally, the recognition that the homeowners hadn't ever approved a ballot measure seeking an out-of-pocket assessment since SROA was established in 1987. 87. So that was an interesting situation. Our infrastructure was failing. All we needed to fix the problems was money, but the economy was in a tank. Housing prices were dropping daily, and the board realized that no owner had an appetite to fork over any money to solve the problem. A very bleak picture, but stay tuned to hear how the story ends with a happy ending. Next slide. The board and the community could have closed up shop and gone home. The future looked so bleak indeed. Instead, to the credit of the board and the SROA leadership, They recognized that we were in a crisis and decided the only option was to tackle the situation straight on. So an aggressive educational campaign was initiated. It was titled Restore the Pride. Next slide. A task force was formed to lead the effort. I'm familiar with it because I was asked to lead the effort. As I had served on the board and as president in the early 2000s and had been a party to creating the crisis, I was there with blinders on, not recognizing where we were going and what trouble we were facing. I thought it was only appropriate to try to correct the situation, and I welcomed the challenge. The task force we formed recognized the fact that a traditional approach wouldn't work. A traditional approach would have had the board study the situation and then come up with a solution and then go to the owners saying, trust us, and vote yes on the proposed ballot measure. That we recognized wouldn't work. So instead, the task force determined that this had to be a different approach, and we had to get the owners to fully understand the seriousness of the situation and have them help come up with and buy into the solution. So over 20 face-to-face meetings were scheduled and held throughout Oregon, Washington, and California with our remote homeowners, second homeowners who lived in those areas. We also held several dozen sessions here in Sunriver. These sessions were educational, they were fact-based, and they were brutally honest sessions. Next slide. The reserve study had recommended that to close the gap in our reserve account would take years to accomplish, but everyone realized that we had to start somewhere. The field troop had recommended it if we could get our owners to agree to add $30 per month to their monthly maintenance fee and commit to putting all of these funds into the reserve account, that we could increase our monthly contribution to our reserves from $47,000 to the $176,000 required. So this chart was used to show what would be needed to bring about the next necessary improvements in our community. The emphasis was on reinvest, renew, and restore the pride. We told owners that we were going to be asking them to increase their monthly dues by $30, with all of these funds going to increase the reserve fund. We distributed this Restore the Pride button to as many owners as we could. Next slide. In the end, the task force used this chart. Again, it was 2009 and we were in a recession. We were asking folks who owned homes here who were having trouble renting their property or having trouble making their mortgage payments, or were even worried about keeping their jobs during that time frame, to believe in and invest in Sunriver's future by increasing their SRA dues by $30 per month. Owners were informed that it would take until the year 2042, if we approved it, before we would reach our goal of having a strong reserve position. But that wouldn't preclude us from making improvements right away in our infrastructure. Next slide. So we said 2009 is the year of the choice, and the choice is yours. So we put the burden of that decision back on our owners. So many skeptics reminded the members of the task force and me that our owners had never approved having assessment imposed on them. We knew that it was an uphill battle, as we needed to at least 60% of our owners, those who voted, to vote yes. So how did the vote turn out? Truly unbelievable. Next slide. With approximately 4,200 eligible voters, 2,556 voted That amounts to 60.8%, which was a great turnout. Normally, you don't get anything close to that. In fact, we believe it was the highest turnout ever up to that time. Next slide. Of those who voted, 82.5% said yes to the idea of increasing their dues $30 a month. It validated the approach the task force had used to educate our owners and let them make the final decision on Sunriver's future. Next slide. As mentioned earlier, in 2000, SROA had been sending out surveys to all of our owners every 5 years. In it, owners are asked what their individual priorities are related to the current and future amenities. So the board used the results of the 2010 survey to begin establishing priorities. So as you can see, with this vote of confidence, the board moved forward with the planning for Shark. They used the amenities master plan and the owner survey to map out our future. Next slide. Where to begin? Well, the owner survey indicated the bike paths were the most used and valued amenities in Sunriver. So that became one of the top priorities, is what can we do for the bike paths? Next slide. With 38 miles of bike paths, most of them had been put in 40 plus years before. They couldn't merely be given a new coat, which we had been doing for years. Next slide. Instead, they needed to be dug up and totally replaced. Next slide. As you can see, they were also widened. We were not meeting new standards on the size of the bike path at the time. So all of the bike paths were widened and expanded. Next slide. Which made it much easier, next slide, for walkers and bicycles to pass each other, as you can see here. So how did we fund this? All of the funding for these 38 miles of new bike paths came from the reserve funds, and no assessment was required or necessary. Next slide. We also had to do something, as you saw earlier, about many of our 65 miles of roads which were in bad shape. Next slide. Those that didn't need to be replaced right away were still upgraded with a chip seal, as seen here. Next slide. But for many, the old pavement had to be ground up. Next slide. Using state-of-the-art equipment. Next slide. And for others, dirt had to be brought in to level out the road. Next slide. And a brand new base had to be laid down. Using rollers to level and smooth the new asphalt. It took a few years to do, but eventually all of the roads had been replaced, either resurfaced and or replaced. Again, all of the funding for these new roads improvements came from the reserve fund, and no assessment was necessary. Next slide. What about tennis courts? I had shown how badly the tennis courts were, that we had 27 of them, and then they needed a lot of work. So some of them had to be totally replaced, and tore out the old netting and brought in new. Others had to have the surface repainted. Next slide. Many had to have fencing surrounding the courts replaced. You can see here a worker trying, next slide, trying to put up the new fencing. So we ended up turning out these old, worn out tennis courts into new state-of-the-art courts. This has attracted many a tournament of regional and national tournaments to Sunriver to play on our 27 tennis courts. Again, all of the funding for these tennis court improvements came from the reserve fund, and no assessment was necessary. Next slide. New pickleball courts. Then along came pickleball. It wasn't long before Sunriver had its own pickleball club demanding to have their own courts. Next slide. Because our owners had approved the 2009 ballot, the board and staff quickly were able to allocate reserve funds to this effort. Several Fort Rock Park tennis courts were converted to pickleball. As we speak, or as I speak, 12 new courts are being created up on the tennis hill. Again, all of the assessments for these pickleball courts came from the reserve fund and no assessment was necessary. Next slide. Rebuilding the tunnels. I mentioned that the tunnels needed work on them. Next slide. One of the things that the Felix group had pointed out was the fact that we needed to begin replacing our aging tunnels. Here is what they look, next slide. Here is what they looked like as they were being built over 50 years ago. They were not designed to last 50 years. Next slide. I don't believe these were expected to last. You had to go single file, as you can see, through them. So what did we do? Well, 2 years ago, the first tunnel was replaced. Here is what the new tunnels look like. You can see that you don't have to walk through the tunnel. You can go side by side. They were widened and the height expanded. And they look pretty nice. So the first one that we did 2 years ago was next to the ranch cabin. This one goes under the road at the village of Sunriver. The current goal is to replace at least one tunnel every year. Again, all of the funding for these new tunnels came from the reserves funds and no assessment was necessary. Next slide. New owners marina. A few years ago, the resort made the decision to upgrade their marina and gave notice to SROA that it would no longer be available for our use, and it would be exclusive for their guests to use. Prior to that, we had shared that resort. It was owned by them, but we had shared it. They wanted to have it just for the resort. So a new marina was built next to Ola's on the Deschutes. The new SROA marina has storage for owners to use to store their kayaks and canoe. That's what the building on the left is. Next slide. All of the funding for this new marina came from reserves funds and no assessment was necessary. Am I beginning to sound redundant? Next slide. On to the North Pool. The North Pool was built in 1972 with a 30-year life expectancy. So it could have been, and maybe should have been, replaced in 2002. So it was long overdue to be replaced. Next slide. So last fall, owners were involved in helping to figure out what to do with the pool. After a very positive vote of our owners in August, you can see that work has begun on the building. This is in the fall, on building an entirely new $5.5 million owners-only pool complex. Next slide. Here's a picture of what the new facility will look like. Plans call for this facility to be completed by May of this year and open for owners to use starting on June 19th. So put that on your calendar. It will have its own leisure lap pool, a zero entry recreation pool, water slide, and a large hot tub. A great addition to complement Shark. Again, all of the funding for this new $5.5 million project came from our reserve funds and no assessment was necessary. Next slide. Then there is Fort Rock Park. Next slide. Not all of the projects are headline makers, but we have replaced all of the aging play structures in Fort Rock Park to make them ADA accessible and safe for children. Next slide. And we put in bathrooms to replace the porta potties that had been there for years. This was high on the list of what the owner survey recommended. They wanted to have bathrooms out in the community. All of the funding for this project came from the reserve funds and no assessment was necessary. Then there is a new entrance to Sunriver, or the village at Sunriver. Next slide. It had been a bottleneck ever since the community was first created. So last year, this circle was built. You can see it was early on when I took the picture. Another picture of the circle from another angle. Next slide. Here is a recent picture of the second circle in front of Starbucks and Brood Awakening. All of the funding for this project came from the reserve funds and no assessment was necessary. Moving on, finally, here is a last completed or scheduled amenity update currently scheduled. Mary McCallum Park. Mary, and many of you have heard her, and I talked about her a little bit in the first class, but her role in Sunriver is greatly underappreciated and unrecognized. She and Betty Gray have never received the credit they both deserve. According to Robert Royston, the landscape architect hired to develop the plan of Sunriver, it was Mary McCallum who made the final decision to not develop the Great Meadow and the riverfront properties in order to keep them available for generations to follow to enjoy. She was an interesting person in her own right. At the age of 18, she was a WASP, the elite women's air special pilots who ferried military aircraft around the world in World War II. She raced sailboats on the Columbia River. She could do anything and would try anything. In fact, while she lived here in Sunriver with her husband, she built her own airplane. Next slide. So it was only appropriate that the community decided to name the owner's park in her honor. But like Mary McCallum herself, the park named after her has really not been appreciated. Next slide. So this is all being changed. The pathways are now going to be paved so they become ADA accessible. The area will be enhanced with the additional of a 2/3 of a mile looping pedestrian only pathway along the river and back through the woods. This should be accomplished by summer. Next slide. This pavilion is being restored and updated, and a second pavilion is being added. Next slide. The wooden tables shown here are being replaced with permanent cement tables located on paver patios. Maybe the most important improvement made at Mary McCallum Park will be replacing the porta potties with new permanent restrooms. Again, all of the funding for this project came from the reserves and no assessment was necessary. So let me ask you, think back to what I described in 2009 and the challenges we faced, and not just surviving as a community, but having any hope of reaching the vision that the founders had established for us. Then think about all that has been accomplished in the decades since then. I know I was redundant, but the reason I did that and showed all of the improvements that have been made in the last 10 years with no assessment required was that was what our task force told owners if they had faith in the board and were willing to approve of a $30 increase in their monthly maintenance fees, we could start accomplishing things, and I think we have. So if you also include all of the improvements that have been made to the Village Mall that we didn't do, and the addition of Shark, then I believe you have to conclude that we truly met our lofty goals established back in 2009 and truly did restore the pride. So let me conclude this portion of the program, and this will be the end of the part 3, by giving you a status report on our reserve account. As you could see from what I just showed you, we've been spending a lot of money out of the reserve account to repair and replace a lot of our amenities. So all of them have been done utilizing the reserve fund. According to Gerhard Beenum, our current treasurer of SROA, in spite of spending all this money on fixing our infrastructure and amenities, we are currently ahead of our plan and are now estimating that we'll reach our 70% goal level by 2035, 5 years ahead of schedule. So I think the slogan that we came up with back in 2009 that said we needed to reinvest, to renew and restore the pride has been achieved, and all the owners have every right to be proud of themselves for believing in their community. Next slide. So that ends the program, official program. I do want to go ahead and do one more thing, and that is to share with you. Can we do that, guys?
We going for the special visit slides?
Let's do that. We have time.
Yeah, Brent, if you could fast forward to the special visit slides.
Many of you who've been here for a while remember the day when President Bush made a surprise visit in 2003. It was a very secret thing. Nobody knew about it officially, but behind the scenes, a lot of work was done in order to accommodate that. So he arrived in 2003. Here's a picture of the scene showing President Bush getting off the airplane, and he was visiting none other than Charlie Peck. Charlie Peck, I mentioned before, was the managing director back in 93 through 98. As it turned out, George Bush and Charlie Peck were roommates at Yale and had been lifelong friends. And Charlie had invited him to come out and visit. And President Bush, while he was president, said, sure. So he came out. Next slide. So he arrived in this airplane with his entourage, and the Secret Service people had come a couple weeks before incognito and done all this searching. They ended up renting the houses around Charlie's house in Crosswater for the Secret Service people and to make sure that it was safe. Next slide. So all of a sudden, all of the roads in Sunriver were closed. So if you wanted to get around Sunriver, you couldn't do it because Bush's airplane landed at the airport and they closed all the roads in order to keep it safe. So here you can see where both sides of the roads with the policemen walking along, making sure everything was safe. Here's a picture of George Bush waving to his fans along the side of the road. Word got out that Bush was here, so all of a sudden, owners started going out to try to see if they could say hi to him and see him. So here is a picture of welcome President Bush that some owners had quickly put together for him. There were people with flags, and there's a sign there that says, Bubba, we love you. Next slide. The Secret Service had these boats all over the place, looking to make sure everything was safe. We had people, SWAT team members on people's roofs with binoculars and so forth, looking, keeping things okay. Here's a helicopter overhead to make sure everything's all right in the air. Here's a picture of Bush and Charlie Peck going out to play golf. Here is a picture of George on the golf course. Here's he waving to some fans and meeting with some fellow golfers. And there's a picture of George and Laura, his wife, out for a walk. So it was interesting. They estimated it was $10 million to cost to you and I as homeowners and as taxpayers to have George come over for a 2-day visit with Charlie. So I just thought it'd be, as part of our history, I thought it'd be interesting to share that with you. So that's the official end. Nathan, do we have anything else we need to do? We have any questions or anything?
Yeah, we'll do a little reminder here real quick. It's super fascinating. I don't know how many of us in the real world can take a $10 million 2-day vacation. We balk at plane flights in the States for $1,500 for 4 of us in our family. So that's amazing when you put that in perspective. Let's go ahead and we'll pull up the Mentimeter slide real quick and just remind everybody about how we are submitting questions tonight for John. So again, you're going to use www.menti.com and event code 58408157. You can also use the YouTube chat if you like to shoot some questions over to John. Looks like the questions are starting to come in, but yeah, we'll take a couple minutes. Again, if you'd like to, just because with us being about 10 minutes after 7, in case we can't get to all your questions, put your email address in there too, and John would be more than happy to get back with you about a specific question about the presentation or something that came up for you during the presentation. John, I guess to kind of start with, while you were talking about pickleball, I don't know why this hit, but pickleball to me has been this amazing sport that I knew nothing about, I feel like, until like 2 or 3 years ago. So I did a little interwebbing while you were doing your presentation. It looks like pickleball was invented in 1965 in Bainbridge Island. Did not realize that. It was actually, I think, a father and 2 of his sons. And again, unofficial information. If I'm wrong, I apologize, but I'm just kind of looking this up real quick. And it's listed as one of the fastest growing sports in the United States. So, in 2010, what do you think it was that was so appealing to the owners of Sunriver to really convert what I think was kind of a more tried and true sport of tennis into something for the homeowners, like the restoration projects and the building projects of those pickleball courts?
Well, I'm not an expert in this, but it's interesting because I think there's a conflict between the tennis purist and the pickleball purist. That they not, from my experience, not many true tennis players play pickleball. It's not worthy of their time and effort. Pickleball, I think, is one that anybody can pick up and start playing right away. And you don't have to take classes. You don't have to spend months and years trying to figure out how to do it. So you can just have four people get together and start hitting the ball over the net. So I think that's the genesis, the popularity. And in Sunriver, we have so many people who are very active in all these other activities who've now been introduced to pickleball. And so we are actually converting some of our tennis courts to pickleball courts because of the popularity. The tennis courts only get about 57% in the summer, or only about 57% of the potential use is actually with tennis. So they're saying, let's convert some of those tennis courts to pickleball, because if you go down to the ones we have now, people are lined up waiting and signing up hours ahead of time to be able to play. So I think that's it.
No, it's fascinating. And up where I live, up in Bend, on the east side of town, there's amazing pickleball set of courts up there that, again, they're always in use. So I think it's something I'm going to have to pick up. Another thing that came in, I think, as you presented on what the Owners Association has done for the funding, I think that has probably shocked a lot of people that didn't realize just how much of an impact, that extra $30, as you put it, for dues really went to establishing Sunriver's Owner Association as just an absolutely amazing fund to be able to do the things that you guys wanted to do. I mean, you talked a lot about the board work. Clearly there's community collaboration on there. Is there anything else that maybe you didn't talk about that really contributed to, I mean, not only the immediacy of solving that problem, but I guess that foresight, I know you kind of worked with a consulting company, but was there anything else that really stood out to you as maybe this is individual to Sunriver of why this was such a success?
Well, I don't want to talk about it in the class, but I was on the board from 2002 to 2004. I was president for 2 years. My claim to fame was 1 year we didn't increase our dues at all. We didn't have any need to spend money, so let's not do anything. So let's not raise the dues. Very conservative, very frugal, very practical. But we weren't looking at what are we going to do with the roads? What are we going to do with the bike paths? What are we going to do? In my second year as president, I asked my board to write an essay on what should we look like. This was 2004 in 2014. And I realized that we were in trouble, but my board didn't. So I had them write an essay. I had one person come back and say, I'd like to have a dog run in 10 years. And another one said they'd like a community garden. And my comment to my board was, we're in trouble. Because if we're not looking at what's going on outside our community and planning for the future, we're in deep trouble. And so I got the genesis going on the idea of thinking, but I couldn't get my board to spend the money to bring in JT Atkins to help us look at our future. It took another board to do that. So I argue I was part of the problem back then, and I came from a business standpoint saying if we don't need this to collect the money, let's not just arbitrarily increase. The association can increase their monthly dues 6% a year without asking for a vote. So I could have done that. I did. I said, let's not do that if we don't have anything. So we weren't forward thinking back then, and they are now. So that's the good news.
No, that's amazing. That's just, I think of so many communities that I've been aware of that haven't had that sort of planning. And I think also because times have changed. I mean, you think about like infrastructure you guys have done in Sunriver around like even the shark and the planning around that I know we'll talk about in another session later, but technology in itself, how fast that has changed alone has put a lot of people and a lot of owners associations in a kind of a precarious situation because they don't have those reserve funds like Sunriver does. So
I'm looking at it, you talk about technology, we do have a task force I'm on looking at broadband. Mm-hmm. And most areas aren't thinking about that in the future. Why do I need that? And we do need it. All of us will. And so I think we're very progressive in looking at that.
Yeah. And I will say, so actually 2 questions just came in about that. And I know you and I chatted a couple of weeks ago, just with some backstory around kind of cable and broadband and bringing fiber in and some of those decisions that have come. Some of the questions are, what do you think the next evolution around, maybe Sunriver Internet as a provider? And I would say, just because I know how complicated it is, as we've talked about it, is kind of keeping it as neutral as possible, just to kind of lay out some of the facts and the situation for it.
Yeah, we have 2 alternatives that we're pursuing. One is to negotiate a new contract with Ben Broadband, and they would bring in fiber to the home and provide that for us. The downside of that is that would be the only one. If you lived in Sunriver, you'd have to use them. And second, it would be a 15-year contract. So those are negative things. The positive, it wouldn't cost homeowners anything more. There's no out-of-pocket cost. The alternative is for us to say, okay, Ben Broadband, we're not going to renew our contract and we're going to do it ourselves. And there again, then that would require us to figure out how to get $15 million or so to build our own network. If you did that, then you could have unlimited number of players on that system and have competition. So those are the task force is struggling with right now.
So the task force is currently kind of undergoing discussions around those scenarios. Yeah. Okay. That's great. No, hopefully that kind of answers some of the questions for the folks that put those in, because, I know as homeowners, it's definitely something, again, we just talked about it with technology. You want to kind of keep moving forward with that, and who knows in 10 years where we're going to be at. So yeah. Good. Another question that came in, you talked about the North Pool, really cool project. I think that's going to be beautiful when it's done. Can you talk a little bit about what precipitated the North Pool being for owners only?
We pay a monthly dues, and we also pay in a recreation fee every year. It's $50, and I initiated that when we did Shark, because we had a room in there with weight room with equipment, and we wanted to have it for homeowners. And the problem was, if we allow owners to come in with unlimited owners, it would be overwhelming. So we said, well, let's establish a price. We came up with $50 a year to be able to use that facility, and that became the owner's recreation card. So you need to have that to use to go into the weight room, exercise room. You needed to get to use the marina. So there are more things, but they're trying to get more utilization for the $50, give you more bang for the buck. So they decided to go ahead and put the North Pool as that again, and it's $50 a year. Whereas if you belong to a health club, you're paying $50 a month or whatever it might be. So the thinking is it's very reasonable cost to do that. So that was that rationale behind it. As an aside, I don't personally agree with that. So,
but it could be something even over time. I mean, maybe that discussion even evolves too. But at least currently, right now, that's what the plan is. Okay, excellent. As we're waiting for some other questions to come in, this is completely off subject, and I apologize for even pulling this out, but I am a superhero Marvel kind of buff, and I've had 2 science pubs that I've moderated where there's been some sort of a strange connection to the Marvel universe. And when you were talking about the wasps, I had heard about the wasps before, and this is kind of a Nathan aside, but I think it's just fascinating how, again, even your talk and getting into the history may have some connections. As you described kind of what their role was, amazing group of women that I've heard of before. But there's actually a character in the Marvel universe that I don't know if Stan Lee, what he was thinking about this, called the Wasp, who is a heroine who her job literally is training and ferrying around the character Ant-Man. So I'm like again, I hate to go this aside, but since we're waiting for some questions, you were saying that, and I'm laughing in my head because I'm like, I feel like I've heard this before, and I did a quick search for it. So my next adventure is to find out if the Wasps, as a unit, as an awesomely decorated, wonderful group of women, has some sort of a connection with Stan Lee in the 1950s and 60s as he's coming up with this stuff.
Funny story about her. She would take owners. They had a bus, and it was an old bus. And she one time took owners down to Christmas Valley for some hike and stuff like that. And the bus broke down, the engine was. And while they were out hiking, she fixed and took all the stuff out of the bus, fixed it all, and put it back in again. So when they got through hiking, they got back on the bus. And the story goes that they had people who really knew cars, and they couldn't have fixed it, and she fixed it.
I had to chuckle because that's just an awesome story. Would have been
she grew up on a farm, so she learned a lot of those stuff when she was growing up over in Eastern Oregon. So
yep, when repairs on that sort of equipment was a little bit easier to do than nowadays too. All right, good. Well, let's see. I think that's a lot of the questions I have now. Folks, we'll kind of leave the next 2 or 3 minutes for folks to submit some additional questions. I'm gonna look through my notes and see if there's anything else. I'm gonna kind of hit the big ones. I think, maybe again, I asked this the last time, but with all these different projects happening in this period of time that you discussed tonight, anyone in particular, like I know clearly Shark is something that is a big thing for you, but any of these projects you talked about tonight that you feel like for you were the most fun to be a part of or know about, or as a resident being there, or the most significance to you?
Actually, I think Shark is, and it's interesting because and we'll talk about it in the class, but it was interesting because people came out and said, why are we doing it? We don't need to do that. Why are we even thinking about it? After we built it, people said, why didn't we build it bigger? It's too crowded, build it bigger, and stuff like that. So it's interesting to how, and I had people when we were doing it saying, John, you're going to force me to sell my house. You're going to give me an assessment, and the economy is in the tank at the same time period.
Mm-hmm.
Economy's in the tank, and you're going to make me so. And I said, gosh, just You can pay $36 is what you'd have to pay a month for your shark assessment. You'd have to do it over 15 years, but you could pay as little as $36 a month. And I said, what's that going to do to your property values? You should vote for it just because that $36 you're going to pay increases your property value. So it was interesting, and I'll talk about it in the class, but it was interesting to see how different people reacted. And we had it where we located it and stuff. Neighbors would say, "Oh, John, this is going to be tough. I rented my house, and God, it's going to be noisy, and it's going to be right next door." And now they advertise walking distance to shark. You know, as an advantage, you can walk to shark from my rental house. So it's just how people's perspective changed over time on that project.
Yeah, no, you talk about increased home values, and people usually jump on board for most things. Hey, I did get a question from YouTube. Gwen Gamble asks, do you have any idea if there are any plans to finish the renovation work, some of which you talked about, of the Village Mall?
I'm trying to get that, because that was the plan, was they did the initial rebuild where it was most visible. So as you're driving into Sunriver and stuff, you see it. But behind there's still a lot of things that need to be upgraded. And I'm trying to get that information from the owners. The Colson family owns the resort now, and I'm trying to get that. The problem sometimes is, and that's what we had back in the 2000s, was the property values were increasing, and the owners didn't want to spend any money because the Village Mall went from $6 million to $12 million, and they didn't do anything to improve it. And so their argument was, why do we want to spend a lot of money putting into the infrastructure when we've doubled our money without doing a thing? And so that was part of the problem we had back then with them doing any upgrades, is they said, you can't justify payback. And the same thing. So we're looking, I worry about that, because the value of the mall has gone up, over time.
Oh yeah.
And they did not buy it as a moneymaker. They made it because they bought it because they love Sunriver, and things had to be improved.
Yeah, makes sense. Let's go. Last question. During this time period you presented on, George Fox helped create new street names for GIS mapping. Anything you can share about how that came about?
Yeah, there were squaw, Indian names, Native American names, not Indian, Native American names, and the decision was made that we should change those to become more generic. And so I think that George Fox, I don't know who came up with the new names, but our names now are not offensive to any of the indigenous organizations. So that was the reason they did that. So we had 4 or 5 names that were potentially offensive, and they got changed. And it was nice because it got changed without any backlash, people protesting about our names. We recognize it should be changed. Thank you for bringing it to our attention. We'll go ahead and change those names.
Yeah.
And names had been established back in the 60s and times have changed. So.
Yeah. Well, hey, again, John, this has been really cool. Again, as somebody that has never vacationed in Sunriver before I moved up here, and somebody that lives in Bend and doesn't make it down to Sunriver nearly as much as I should, this has been a really good adventure in this 3-part series. So just definitely want to tell you thanks for that. I guess, do you have any parting words before I close us out tonight?
I'm not sure how we're going to do the next 2 sessions, but I want the people who are listening in or watching to consider signing on for these next 2 classes. And I'll be working with Sunriver U to try to figure out what kind of schedule and how do we do it. But I appreciate OSU Cascades for stepping up and agreeing to help put these on. It's made it a lot easier for me, so I appreciate it.
No, and us too. I mean, because I think, it's one thing to put this stuff together, but we need the content. So I think this has been a really fun adventure into kind of a community partnership for the presentation, especially in this strange time of COVID. It's just been a lot of fun.
Sure. I also want to thank the two individuals from Connect Central Oregon for their help, Daniel and Brent. So.
Yep. No, I completely agree. And it's been fun. I mean, again, officially OSU Cascades and Connect Central Oregon, thank you so much. But I think overall, the programming's coming from Sunriver U and the Owner Enrichment Committee. So I think they're the ones that sort of came to me with this idea. And we were talking about this in the fall, early winter. So I think it's been a pretty successful collaboration. I look to see kind of what happens beyond here. And again, for all of our viewers, definitely check out sunriveru.com for their events, because again, for free events, you've got some pretty amazing things that are coming up, not only for this next month, but going forward. And I know they're really getting into the cycle of the new programs coming up. So definitely pay attention to that. So I guess officially this concludes our series for this one. It's been a lot of fun, everybody. Hope you have enjoyed it. Share it. Again, these are all on the Sunriver U YouTube channel. So if you've really enjoyed tonight, or if you didn't get a chance to watch all of it, do a little viewing party in your house when we get a little bit back more to normalcy, so we can get some people back in some group events. Put it on your big blow up screen in your backyard, do something fun like that. But I really just want to say thanks again to everybody. And I guess without any other updates, guys, again, it's been a lot of fun and really appreciate your participation. So we'll see you at the next Sunriver U events, and thank you very much for joining us tonight.
All right.